And now I would like to present our next speaker. There's a Lancet series on 2014, and Julian Savulescu was a co-author. Peter Meyer-Abt quoted this Lancet series quite often. So we have the pleasure to have Julian Savulescu talk about increasing international collaboration, reducing waste. Professor Savulescu is the director of the Oxford Center for Practical Ethics. He is a philosopher, but has also a background in medicine and neurosciences, and he's also co-director of the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities at the University of Oxford. Julian, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Bernice, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I thought since I'm the first speaker, I might zoom out before I start my talk, which is quite precise in its recommendations, and situate this conference around a culture of collaboration in the context of the great problems we face of our time. So in 2012, I wrote a book with Ingemar Persson called Unfit for the Future: The Urgent Need for Moral Enhancement. And the thesis of this book was, we face existential threats from the radical advance of our technology. Nuclear war is still a reality, but biological war or misuse of biological research is an even greater threat, and we perhaps have seen an inkling of that through COVID-19. But more importantly, we face new threats through collective action problems such as climate change, poverty, inequality, antimicrobial research. And the basic thesis of the book was that our cognitive capacities have enormously increased in the last 200 years, and particularly the last 20 years through computing and now artificial intelligence. But our psychological and moral capacities have remained relatively static since we evolved from the African savannah. So human psychology is unfit for dealing with global collective action problems. Altruism, or the willingness to cooperate or collaborate, as you're terming it, evolved to facilitate cooperation within small groups of human beings of around 150. So we can cooperate around, for example, utilising a fixed resource when we can observe what other people do, we have their respect, our free riding is punished, and our contribution makes a difference. But global collective action problems like climate change involve hundreds of millions of people who are anonymous to each other, and they prey upon the biases that humans have. We are focused on the near future, not the distant future. We care about others, but mainly ourselves, our friends and family, and our co-nationals. And most importantly, we've evolved a causal sense of responsibility. We feel we're responsible for what we do, but not for what we allow to happen. And climate change will affect other people in the distant future and will require significant sacrifices from ourselves and our families. So we argued that we won't solve problems like climate change simply by providing reasons to people. We're psychologically not set up for that. And in the book, we embrace the possibility of moral bioenhancement, the possibility of biological interventions to change human dispositions, but I don't want to deal with that. The traditional ways of dealing with collective action problems have been either, as Bernice mentioned, incentives or disincentives, carrots or sticks. As the famous British philosopher Henry Sidgwick said, there are two basic reasons for action: morality, doing the right thing that is good for everyone, or self-interest. And what incentives and disincentives do is they align self-interest with morality. So the solution to collective action problems is for those who have power, institutions, funders, journals, peers, or, as I will talk about, research ethics committees, is to create incentives and disincentives for cooperation. You won't get cooperation, particularly for collective action problems at a global level, through providing very good reasons. So it's not enough. And in fact, science now is a global collective action problem, like climate change, like antimicrobial resistance like poverty. And the reason for that is science is not about Isaac Newton now sitting under a tree watching an apple fall and discovering gravity, if that really story is true. It's not about an individual. It's about enormous groups collaborating. So in 1996, with Ian Chalmers, who established the Cochrane Collaboration, we provided 5 suggestions that research ethics committees could introduce that would improve cooperation. And they were based on the observation that, first of all, ethics committees weren't requiring people to even examine what research had already been done and were repeating placebo-controlled trials even when effective treatments had been established. And that valuable research, particularly negative results, weren't being published, and so the research was repeated. So I'm going to revisit 5 recommendations that we made in 1996 and ask how have they been implemented, or have they been implemented? And so this, I've just mentioned that problem. Now, Bernice mentioned Peter Bayard's interest in a later publication I did, which was in 2014. And I won't talk particularly about this publication, but it's based on this. This wasn't in the publication, but this is the basis of it. That moral responsibility is a function of 2 things. It's how foreseeable are the consequences of your act or omission, and how avoidable are those, or how much control do you have. So unnecessarily delaying life-saving research by 1 year into a disease which kills 100,000 people per year is to be morally responsible for those 100,000 deaths. Okay. So every time you introduce inefficiency in review of research that has potential life-saving implications, you are responsible for the people who are harmed as a result of that. You won't see them, and again, we're insensitive. We empathise with single individuals who are in front of us. We're insensitive to numbers and statistics. As Stalin said, the death of an individual is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. So this leads, so bureaucracy is unethical. So the 2014 paper is a whole series of detailed suggestions of how regulators, institutions, funders and so on can make research more efficient. Because in medicine, time is not only money, time is lives. So, we argued, for example, in the past I've argued for a single application form, not multiple institutional application forms, an expert committee review for multiple sites, and we have a large number in that paper of suggestions. But in this paper, I want to focus on the role of ethics committees in reducing waste. So I want to update the paper that we proposed. So here were 5 recommendations we said that should be implemented. And these seem fairly common sense. You should require a systematic review of existing research before approving a new study that exposes people to risks. I mean, the most flagrant example of this not being done was in 2001, where a 24-year-old healthy woman, a technician at Johns Hopkins University, volunteered for a study into asthma and was given hexamethonium and died several weeks later of pulmonary fibrosis. And it was known in the 50s and 60s that hexamethonium, when inhaled, causes pulmonary fibrosis. The researchers at Hopkins, one of the world's leading institutes, just failed to do a systematic review, and the Ethics Committee approved the research without requiring a systematic review. We also argued that you should require a summary of the relevant existing research to be made available to participants. You should collaborate or cooperate with participants. You should require registration of clinical trials at inception, and you should require commitment to publish the results. And Ethics Committee should audit the results of research previously approved. So we argued this in 1996. How much of this has been done? That was the first recommendation. Now, many randomised controlled trials still do not perform or reference systematic reviews in their study justification. So there's still room for improvement. And there's also concerns now about the quality of systematic reviews themselves. In every human endeavour, there emerges waste abuse and negligence. Tools have been developed to help evaluate the quality of systematic reviews, and I'll talk briefly about them. There's now also large numbers of low-quality studies, particularly in China, emerging, and continuing publication and citation bias. So, what is the current state of the art in this simple proposition that we should ask or require researchers to just see what has been done in the relevant field? Well, here's an example from my home, Melbourne, the Royal Children's Hospital. They require that researchers provide a focused review of previous studies, if available. And the regulatory body, the National Health and Medical Research Council, recommends that where such reviews exist, researchers refer to these. So various regulatory agencies, the MHRA in the UK doesn't require systematic reviews, the NIH recommends them, and the EU regulations don't require them. So, they seem to be essential, but they're not in place. So here's an example. In 2013, only 1 in 35 randomised controlled trials used an updated systematic review in the design of the trial, and in 13 in 35 discussed previous systematic reviews. In 2018, a cross-sectional analysis of randomised controlled trials in 2 of the most prestigious journals, Journal of American Medical Association, New England Journal of Medicine, only 54% cited a relevant systematic review or meta-analysis. So again, this goes back to the act-omission distinction. People believe that if you fail to do something, you're not morally responsible for the outcome. If you failed to do a systematic review, you didn't kill somebody, but in fact, you did, if you can foresee the consequences, fail to do something that you're morally responsible for. So the researchers that failed to do the systematic review in Ellen Roche's case caused her death. And most recently, a 2022 systematic review and meta-analysis, a mean percentage of 17% of clinical studies used a systematic review to inform their research. So one thing you can do in Switzerland is require researchers to review the literature. I'm sorry if that sounds like a platitude. Now, there's also the emerging problem that systematic reviews are reducing in quality. So Roberts and Kerr argue that they cause themselves research waste. They promote underpowered trials and over-inclusion of low-quality trials which inflate treatment effects, particularly given publication bias, and that they constitute a form of research waste themselves. So in 2019, a total of 80 systematic reviews were being published per day, up from 11 in 2010. So another thing that you can do is set quality control measures on the systematic reviews that you require. And indeed, the evidence is that they are poor quality. So in 2017, only 2.8% of systematic reviews were of high quality and 89.4% were of critical low quality. There's large numbers of systematic reviews now coming out of China. There are instruments such as the bias instrument from the Cochrane collaboration to evaluate bias, and various other protocols such as PRISMA, which can be used to evaluate them. And the inclusion of these low-quality studies arguably introduces bias and can introduce potential conflicts of interest. So Roberts et al. Claim that the obsessive zeal to find every published trial can result in even completely fraudulent studies being included in a systematic review. So one good example of this is a Cochrane review, the sort of gold standard for systematic reviews, of the effects of high-dose mannitol was retracted after it emerged there was no evidence that any of the included trials actually took place. So we have another problem, and that is research fraud. So there's a number of reasons for low-quality research. I don't have time for those. COVID-19 has raised new challenges. There's methodological anarchy in some fronts, embraced by some under the excuses of urgency and time. Simultaneous research. So 206 trials investigating hydroxychloroquine were registered with the NIH Trials Registry just in the US. At the time, there was political interest in hydroxychloroquine. So this is a huge waste and failure of cooperation. So a 2016 review of systematic trials, systematic reviews in major journals found that only 2.5% of themselves looked at the ethics of the studies that were involved. So another emerging problem, particularly with research from some parts of the world, is whether, even if the research is methodologically sound, whether it was appropriately ethically reviewed. So research continues to not be published. And this is another thing that you could introduce to reduce waste and increase collaboration. It's require publication even of negative results. So a 2018 study of Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment identified 744 relevant clinical trials from 1995 onwards. 67% were industry sponsored, and they were twice as likely not to be published. 73% of the clinical trials were not published, which meant that 66,000 people who incurred the risks of trial participation did not contribute to the medical literature or to harms to future people. So I mentioned citation, publication bias. That continues to be a problem. I'll pass over the requirement to provide the results to participants. Another issue has been the registration of clinical trials. There's been more progress on that, and EU policies will require this year that trials are registered. However, in many cases they continue not to be registered, or if they do, the final results and publications do not actually follow the protocol that was pre-registered. So a 2019 study of trials in ophthalmology found that only 64% were registered, and of these there were discrepancies with the primary outcome measures in 47%. So again, that's something that you could do. A requirement to publish research. So there are now more requirements by journals to make research, including raw data, available. But again, there are significant persisting problems with this. For example, in many cases, raw data from industry-sponsored trials are not available. So there are some interesting initiatives. For example, the PLOS Journal of Biology will approve a study based on the methodology without requiring any results. So this, I think, is another important initiative that you could adopt. The approval of studies, approval of research prior to the derivation of results, so that regardless of the results, it's going to be published. And in terms of auditing of results, there's very little auditing of research by ethics committees. So in 1996, we made 5 proposals for how research could be improved to reduce waste and increase collaboration. In many cases, those recommendations have not been taken up. And this is a requirement. The reason for that is that there isn't any directive for research ethics committees, in many cases, to do these tasks. So we will require incentives and disincentives and direction rather than just arguments. Thank you.